Hiya, good evening everyone, and welcome to our second lecture of the year and our annual Jeff Wilde Lecture. And today we have a lecture from Kevin Michaels on profiles in courage, bold leaders who shape today's jetliner ecosystem. So we have an introduction to our speaker. Kevin Michaels is Managing Director of AeroDynamic Advisory, a specialty consulting firm focused on the global aerospace and aviation industries. He has 34 years of experience, including hundreds of consulting engagements for leading aviation and aerospace companies across the globe. Kevin is a globally recognised expert in the aerospace, manufacturing and MRO sectors and has significant functional expertise in business-to-business marketing, customer satisfaction, M&A advisory, technology assessment, cluster development and strategic planning. His experience spans the air transport, business and general aviation and military sectors. He is a contributing columnist to Aviation Week and Space Technology in Forbes. He also chairs the Industry Advisory Board of the University of Michigan's Aerospace Engineering Department and is on the Board of Directors of Pronant, a leading aerospace distributor. Dr. Michaels holds BS, Aerospace Engineering and MBA degrees from the University of Michigan and MSc and PhD degrees in International Relations from the London School of Economics. Kevin authored AeroDynamic Inside the High-Stakes Global Jetliner Ecosystem, winner of the 2019 Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award. So I'll just hand over to Kevin for our lecture.
Thank you very much, Amina. I do appreciate it, and thanks for all of you for joining. I'm sorry we had a few logistical issues at the very beginning, but thanks for hanging in there with us. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is the book project that I undertook back in 2015. Book it took me 3 years to write, which is it was called AeroDynamic. And Amina, if you could go to the next page, it was a book about the ecosystem, about the aerospace ecosystem. What I had noticed was that since the Sporty Game, a book that was written in the early 1980s, which was a book, fantastic book about the business of aerospace, of commercial aerospace, there hadn't really been something written since then that really captured the whole business dynamic aspect of it. And furthermore, the industry had changed quite a bit since 1980. The end of the Cold War came along, and that opened up the industry in a way that few would have foreseen. And we really went from a world where we had two separate ecosystems, a Soviet ecosystem, if you will, where the jets were sold into Asia, China, obviously the USSR, parts of Africa, and then a Western ecosystem, with Airbus and Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and others. So it really became a single ecosystem. And so in doing the research for this book, I not only drew on my experience of having been a management consultant for 30 some years, but also did a wide-ranging series of interviews, including a very productive set of interviews in Derby with Rolls-Royce. So what I wanted to share is there were 5 leaders that stood out to me in doing this research. I'm not suggesting they were the 5 most important, but I think they are all consequential and they have very different stories and really shed light on the diversity of experiences in our industry. And so I'd like to share those thoughts with you. So next page, Amina. So the 5 are the 5 which I'll take you through are from Airbus, Honeywell. You'll see Sir Ralph from Rolls-Royce and Brian Rowe down below, and Carolyn Corvi. And so I'd like to share those stories. I'm also going to touch a little bit on what's happening with COVID and the supply chain. I know it's of great interest to all of you, and the Midlands aerospace cluster is under a great deal of stress, and we'll leave it for Q&A as well. So if we could go then to the next slide, please. So Carolyn Corvi, why Carolyn Corvi and who is she? Carolyn Corvi was a lean pioneer at Boeing and for our industry, and she has a very, very interesting and unconventional story. First of all, she was a history major, and she joined Boeing in 1974, not as an engineer, but in a non-technical role, which is a huge advantage, at the time. And she's coming in as a female into an organization that's very male dominated, very dominated by male engineers in the 1970s. She shows great promise. She catches a great break in the 1987-1988, where she goes to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as a Sloan Fellow. And at that time, there was some cutting edge research going on the Toyota production system, on the automotive industry. And what they were really figuring out at MIT at the time, led by a guy named James Womack, was that the Toyota production system was vastly superior to the approach used in the West by either European automotive OEMs or American automotive OEMs. And they produced a book called The Machine That Changed the World, which really documented the fact that the Japanese system could develop a car in 1/3 of the time with 1/3 of the hours and 1/3 of the resources. And this got her thinking about the aerospace industry. She went and took a tour of a SNECMA facility in Villaroche. In 1989, they were starting to implement some aspects of lean, but the first time she really saw a truly lean factory was a joint venture between General Motors and Toyota in 1992. It was an automotive factory called NUMMI, and it was in California. And she said that day changed her life. She told the Seattle Times, "I've never seen anything like it. My poor husband, I talked to him until 2 in the morning." She saw this vision now of what a lean facility could look like and how that could apply to aerospace. And that set her thinking about very different things. She rose up the ranks of Boeing. She became the head of Propulsion Systems Division in 1995. She went to Japan with a lean consultant from Pratt & Whitney, wanted to bring a moving assembly line back to aerospace. And eventually in 2000, she took over as GM on the 737. And one of the questions she asked, and at the time they were building 21 737s a month, and they felt it was impossible, a lot of the old timers, to build more than 21 737s a month. And she asked the question, why? And started challenging conventional wisdom and why they couldn't do it. And ironically, there was a major earthquake in 2001 in the Seattle area that led to them consolidating facility, and that gave Carolyn her chance to take a white sheet approach where you bring the engineers and support people to the factory floor. It was called Move to the Lake. And this really allowed her to unleash a lot of the ideas that she had seen in the automotive industry. And the rest is history. They reduced the time to assemble a 737 from 22 days to 13 days. And this, of course, set the stage for what we saw up until the COVID crisis and the MAX crisis, where Boeing was building more than 50 737s a month. So a very interesting and unique story by a very unconventional leader who came in through an unconventional career path, Carolyn Corvi. Next, please. So Bernard Ziegler, and I think many of you will be familiar with Bernard Ziegler and his enormous impact at Airbus. But he is the former senior vice president of engineering. He was the son. The Ziegler name, of course, is famous because he was the son of the former Airbus CEO Henri Ziegler, and he was a military pilot. A test pilot for the Dassault Mirage in 1968, at Airbus he became the chief test pilot in 1972, and he flew some of the early versions of the A300, A310, A320, and A340. Ultimately, he became the senior vice president of engineering. The fuel crisis of the early 70s provided impetus for some major improvements in navigation. In other words, it got Airbus thinking about how could they make a better product than Boeing? How could they differentiate themselves with technology? And Airbus, and it's often forgotten now, really pioneered the two-person cockpit on the A300B and the A310 by leveraging a new component called a flight management system. Now, this eliminated the navigator, that third person in the cockpit. And this means jobs. So in France, he actually received death threats from disgruntled pilots or navigators, who felt their jobs were at risk. But they pressed forward, and they brought forward this two-person cockpit, forward-facing, leveraging the flight management system. But that wasn't the biggest innovation. There were much bigger things to follow. And so on the A320, he was a major advocate of fly-by-wire controls, of taking this technology that heretofore was used primarily in military, and not only bringing fly-by-wire into commercial jetliners, but putting full envelope protection around the A320. And it's a very different philosophy compared to Boeing, which always favored sort of having the pilot in charge and letting the pilot decide as to what parts of the flight envelope you could go to. Airbus challenged that wisdom and said, no, there are parts of the envelope where it doesn't make sense for the pilot to go. And of course, along with this came side sticks. And side sticks are not only standard today, but they actually shorten the aircraft, reduce the weight of the aircraft. They shorten the aircraft by, a full foot, and not widely appreciated. So the A300, another aspect of the technology development at Airbus was composites. And it was really the industry's first use of composites in primary structure. And the A300 was the first two-engine wide-body. And of course, wide-bodies are a subject near and dear to everyone's heart in the Derby and Midlands area. But in this case, it's actually Airbus that gave GE the chance to move into the jetliner business. GE was primarily a military propulsion provider, and the A300 really opened the door for GE to come into the industry. Next, please. So Brian Rowe. So again, a big competitor of Rolls-Royce, right? And I get that, but Brian Rowe is a Brit. He was born in London in 1931. He received a typical secondary education, and the apprenticeship and that sort of thing. And in 1947, joined the de Havilland Engine Company. He later joined GE in the late 1950s in the Lynn facility in Massachusetts, where they make the smaller engines. And he eventually moved to Cincinnati, to Evendale in the late 60s, and became general manager for the CF6. And eventually he became the leader for GE Aviation. He launched several new engines, the CF34, which is used for business and regional jets, of course, famously used on the CRJ, and the CF680C2, used on twin aisles, and in the military world, the F-110. But he had CFM opportunity came along in the early 80s when it became clear that Boeing was going to need to re-engine the 737-1200, which had JT8Ds on it. He approached Jack Welch with an idea to form a joint venture with the French OEM Snecma. And he was a major proponent of bringing forward that joint venture, which now it's arguably the most successful joint venture, not only in aerospace, but one could argue it's the most successful joint venture in any industry right now, let alone an American-French joint venture. But his greatest legacy was with the 777, and he had a vision that one day twin aisles would move away from being four-engine to using massive two-engine designs. And he approached Jack Welch with this idea, which would later become the GE90. He went into his office, he unrolled the drawings, the conceptual drawings of what the GE90 could be. And Jack Welch, as I heard in the interviews for my book, basically wasn't interested and basically said, didn't pay attention. And Brian Rowe was furious, ordered his assistant to roll up the drawings and stormed out of Jack Welch's office. And Jack Welch said, wait a minute, Brian, come back. Let me hear your story again. And he convinced Jack Welch that it was worth pursuing. But then the next issue was he didn't have an aircraft. And Airbus, of course, at the time had the A340 concept. This really didn't fit into Airbus's vision of what they wanted to do. So he then had to convince Boeing that there was a market opportunity for a twin aisle using two very large, gas turbines. And so he was eventually successful there. And the vision here was that one day we would have engines that have more than 100,000 pounds of thrust. Today we take that as commonplace with what's going on, of course, at Rolls-Royce and the UltraFan and other things. But no, this wasn't commonplace at the time. And it was really his vision that not only set the stage for these large, massive thrust gas turbines, along with Rolls-Royce, but he also was instrumental in starting the CFM joint venture as well. So a very, very strong legacy for Brian Rowe. Next, please. So this is a person that many of you may not recognize, Don Bateman, or even a name you may have heard of or thought about. But actually, Don Bateman, in a lot of ways, is one of the giants in our jetliner ecosystem. And he really set the stage for what became, what made the jetliner business so safe. And that created a virtuous circle where passengers were more inclined to travel because it was safe and it grew and so forth. But Don Bateman, he's Canadian. His obsession with aviation safety could be traced back to his youth in Saskatchewan, Canada. In 1940, he broke his elementary school rules to visit the scene. There was a mid-air collision near his home in Saskatchewan between two military trainers, and he kind of cut school and went to the scene of this accident. And as part of his punishment, his elementary school teacher ordered him to write a detailed account of what he had witnessed. And in his assignment, which he handed in, the teacher told him, you sure can't spell, you must be a future engineer. And turned out his teacher was correct. In 1958, Bateman joined Boeing to work on the 707 avionics, and he later joined a local startup called United Electronics, which was later acquired by Teledyne. Flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders, which we all take for granted today, they really came into vogue in the 1950s and 1960s. There were three major airline crashes at Scandinavian Airlines. And Don began to ask the question, is there something that we can do about this? What can we do about improving the safety of aircraft? And around the mid-60s is where he really started focusing on how can we reduce the odds of a mid-air collision. So in the late 1960s, Bateman's team collaborated with Boeing and SAS to demonstrate a new system, something called a ground proximity warning system, which alerted pilots that their aircraft was in danger of flying into the ground or into an obstacle. The controlled flight into terrain rates declined, and the Federal Aviation Administration in the US mandated that airlines use ground proximity warning systems in 1974 after a TWA 727 crash in the States. Now, this was a step forward, ground proximity warning system, but it wasn't the end all because there were major gaps and problems with the system. So in the early 1990s, Don Bateman concluded that he could improve the system that he had invented if he combined GPS systems with reliable terrain data to cover as much of the world's terrain as possible. So in other words, the early systems of ground proximity warning system, we had decent data for Europe and for North America and parts of South America. But it turned out the best terrain data in the world, and certainly for the Eastern world, was in the former Soviet Union. And this had been mapped. So Bateman came up with the idea of approaching the Russians, and again, the Cold War had ended in 1991, to buy this terrain data. And so Bateman didn't have the budget, and he found money in his budget from test equipment. So it was kind of on the sly. He found some money, he approached the Russians, and he acquired this data. And this gave the ground proximity warning system a whole new edge. They added the E to it, and it became EPGWS, Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System. And several airlines, including British Airways and United Airlines, tested this. But the real turning point, like so often in safety, unfortunately, was tied to a crash. There was an American Airlines 757 that crashed into a mountain in Colombia. And in response, the American installed enhanced ground proximity warning system on its entire fleet. It was mandated by the FAA. It soon followed in Europe. And this modest investment that Bateman developed with money from his test equipment budget to acquire data from the Russians now became what became a staple in the jetliner business, and it ultimately made it safer and set the stage for what we have today. Next page, please. So how can I give a discussion to the Royal Aeronautical Society without talking about Sir Ralph Robbins? And Sir Ralph Robbins has clearly cemented his legacy, in our industry, forever. And he rolled, and many of you could tell this story better than me, but it really stood out to me. He joined Rolls-Royce as a graduate apprentice in the mid-50s, worked on various civil aero engines, became head of the company's American operations, managing director of its industrial marine division, and ultimately commercial director of the company. So he rose through the ranks and eventually ran Rolls-Royce, and he oversaw the acquisition of Allison engines in 1995 and BMW's engine business in 2000. So that broadened Rolls-Royce's product lines out to include a much stronger presence, not only in business jets and in turboshafts, but even in military engines, on engines like the V-22 tilt rotor. Total care, the service approach, the unique service approach that Rolls-Royce really pioneered, cost per hour maintenance where the OEM takes care of everything, that really took off on his watch. And by the late 1990s, it was a transformed company, under his leadership, and took its place at the top tier of manufacturing. But I think, his legacy may be defined more than anything else by his unflagging support for the Trent engine program. And, speaking of that, the 777, which really started in 1991 and didn't come to the market until 1995. But it reached, they were looking at engine selection, who would be on the 777, and fearing that, a last minute Rolls-Royce or political intervention might get in the way, GE cut a payment. And many of you will remember this. In 1991, GE bought British Airways Wales engine overhaul facility. And at the same time, BA announced that it had selected the GE90 for the 777. And this was a massive shock, not only around the world, but clearly in the United Kingdom, where BA selected a GE engine on the 777. And the question then went into many potential customers' heads. If Rolls-Royce couldn't capture its own flag carrier for the 777, what does that say about the future of the Trent? All Nippon Airways cited BA's lack of confidence of the Trent as contributing to its decision to go with Pratt & Whitney on the 777 and the PW4000. This was a 3-horse race. In September 1991, Thai Airways did select the Trent, but it was a very small order. But at least there was a launch customer. There were no orders for the Trent in 1992 or 1993. And by 1994, there was a raging debate within Rolls-Royce regarding whether or not Rolls-Royce would cancel the Trent 800. So as this storm raged, as there was all this uncertainty, not only in Derby, but in British aerospace in general, Ralph Robbins never lost confidence. He had steadfast leadership. Charles Cuddington, former executive that worked with him, he recalled one particularly testy meeting with a potential customer where, after debating Robbins to cancel the Trent, they stepped onto the elevator. And he said by the time, they were on the 35th floor, by the time they got to the bottom of the building, Sir Ralph had convinced his adversary that it made sense to continue on with the Trent. And he called that the ultimate elevator speech, but Rolls still needed orders. And so as it continued on, it started to redefine its approach to developing engines. And And the Trent 800 was done, and Project Derwent came along, and it really restructured the way Rolls approached development programs. And the development was actually quite smooth. But one of the turning points in Rolls-Royce's history, and I think most Rolls-Royce executives would agree with this, is in 1995, where Singapore Airlines stepped forward and said, we will order the Trent, we will order 77 Trent-powered 777s for $12 billion. So 157 Trent 800 engines were ordered, a $2 billion order, and this literally saved the Trent program. And what was significant about this as well is that Singapore Airlines was a loyal Pratt & Whitney customer. So Rolls-Royce managed to flip Singapore Airlines. And of course, since then, Singapore's been nothing but really a loyal Rolls-Royce customer since this fateful date in the mid-1990s. But this set the stage. Emirates went on to select Rolls-Royce, as they started rolling out their large numbers of twin aisle orders. And by 1996, Rolls had achieved 32% of the orders on A330s and the 777 against much larger U.S. rivals. And at this, I didn't know Sir Ralph personally, but again, a story shared with me by Robert Nuttall, someone that many of you will know. And he said, in characteristic form, Sir Ralph really made it seem simpler than it was. And he said, look, basically, we at Rolls-Royce had three choices in the mid-1990s. Choice one is we don't do the Trent and the company fails. Choice two is we try the Trent, it doesn't succeed, and the company fails. Or the third option is we try the Trent, we succeed, and Rolls-Royce goes on. And he said there was no decision. There was no decision at all. It was clear that door number three was the only option we had. We had to do it. The company was on the line, and Sir Ralph deserves much of the credit for stepping forward at that fateful time. All right. So next slide, please. So those are 5 leaders, and I was asked to say a few things about the COVID crisis and what it could mean for aerospace. So I'm going to switch subject on you now, and just a couple comments here, and I'm very interested in your Q&A, any questions you may have. But clearly, going back in time and having had the chance to study this industry in writing the book, it's very clear that we had some nasty downturns before in the 1970s. Where production was more than halved in serious downturns. But we've never had a downturn like this where production and the aftermarket and MRO were cut by 50% or more in a very short period of time. And so here we are. And, my company, it's a 9-person boutique, and we don't see air travel returning to where it was pre-COVID levels until late 2023. And, a lot of this, as in Europe right now, in the restrictions that have been put up, it really comes down to the ability to travel internationally, and the restrictions between borders. Next page, please. And I think this is particularly important for twin aisles and for Rolls-Royce. How will air travel change on the other side of COVID? I personally think leisure travel, once the vaccines are out and the restrictions come down, will come roaring back. I mean, the fundamentals that drove leisure travel expansion, the rising middle class in Asia, increasing disposable income, the tendency of the younger generations to spend money on experiences rather than tangible goods, those aren't changing. That'll all come back. But the question is what happens with business travel. Now, business travel is, roughly speaking, about 30% of the trips. But for many airlines, and I'm showing here a U.S. airline example, it could be about half of the revenue. And in a recent survey done by the Global Business Travel Association, what they found was that intra-company travel, in business travel, I for one don't think that Zoom calls or team calls will replace in-person sales calls. A company that doesn't engage in in-person sales calls will lose. But about 30% of all business trips are intra-company trips, going to another site, employees commuting to work, training sessions. That's what will change structurally on the other side of this crisis. And I do think that, and I'm showing you survey results from the Global Business Travel Association, intra-company travel that will suffer the most. And I think what you're going to see is you will see a structural shift where there will be less intra-company travel even when things get back to normal. What does that mean? It means fewer premium fare passengers on, say, transatlantic flights, and that increases the pressure to downgauge. So it means that the 787 and A350, which have been relative winners in this crisis, the pressure to use them versus the larger twin aisles only increases. It means that the incentive to use a A321neo or an XLR across the Atlantic, that also increases as well. So that's certainly something we need to watch. Next slide, please. So what do we see in production? We see in units, and I'm showing here jetliners and turboprops, not getting back to where we were. And these are, this is production and not deliveries. It's production, which is what I think most of you care about. We don't see it getting back to pre-COVID levels until 2026, 2027. And I think what's also important, and this is a challenge for the Midlands, is the mix is going to change. And whereas before the crisis, 23% of the jetliners and turboprops were twin aisles, we see it on the other side of the crisis as being something closer to 15%. So there is a mix shift taking place in all this, and that will create a challenge for Rolls. Now, the good news for Rolls is that as we downgauge the aircraft that are going to be produced, the A350, of course, Rolls-Royce has a sole source position on that. And on the 787, Rolls-Royce has a nice position also on that. And those are two of the winners in all this. MRO, by the way, and I don't have a slide on this, MRO is going to come back much sooner. We actually see MRO recovering by 2023. And Rolls-Royce, I think, when things get going, could really see its aftermarket revenues come roaring back in 2022, 2023. Next page. But in the supply chain, and I know many of you or most of you are suppliers, what's going to happen. There was a lot of vertical integration going on before the crisis. It's understandable that it was going on because we had had such a long period of constant production increases. So the risk of vertically integrated was viewed as relatively low by OEMs, aircraft and engine OEMs. But now here we are in a period of excess capacity. Do you really want to be vertically integrated in a time where there's a lot of excess capacity? And we're seeing some of that being unwound. I mean, Airbus had plans to vertically integrate on the A320neo geared turbofan nacelle. They backed away from those plans, awarded that contract to Collins Aerospace, now known as Raytheon Technologies. Rolls-Royce, of course, famously is unwinding a bit. It will be selling ITP, its Spanish subsidiary, as well as some other assets that they haven't disclosed publicly. I mean, Rolls-Royce is more vertically integrated than its peers in the aero engine business. And so Rolls-Royce undoubtedly is scrutinizing, a lot of those capabilities. Some of these are going to absolutely make sense to retain their core, and some of them are not. And another one near and dear to the UK is Bombardier selling its Short Brothers subsidiary to Spirit AeroSystems. In other words, Bombardier concluded that having a major aerostructures capability selling to third-party customers wasn't core to Bombardier, which of course is having major balance sheet issues. Boeing is an interesting case study on this on the right, and Boeing has a number of major initiatives where it's vertically integrating, and I think Boeing is revisiting those. It's going to unwind some of those. One of my favorites that I like to pick on is APU's, a joint venture with Safran. Does it really make sense for an aircraft OEM to be a joint venture partner and an APU OEM to take on Honeywell and Pratt Canada? I don't think that's very sensible. And we haven't heard much, and I don't think much is going to happen there as an example. To me, that's a prime candidate for something where Boeing's going to not invest in that and focus on other areas like survival. Next page. Oh, this didn't come through. So yeah, we did a conversion on these slides right before the call, and so I'm going to talk to this a little bit, but what I'm going to envision is if we think about the supply chain in tiers, tier one being the major systems and aerostructures, tier two being components and parts manufacturing in the aerostructures world, tier three being machine shops, make to print, and tier four being raw material, forge and casting. So that's the taxonomy. And the question is, what's going to happen with tier ones? And I think what we're going to see here is, like the OEMs, I think tier ones are going to purge some of their underperforming and non-core assets. Triumph, for example, is exiting its aerostructures business, selling off those pieces. I think that's quite logical. You know, amongst the tier ones, avionics and system suppliers are the least vulnerable, given their market diversification and exposure to aftermarket. Who's the most vulnerable? Aerostructures and interior suppliers, undoubtedly. They are very much linked to production volumes. We're going to see some M&A, some consolidation. Cash-rich tier ones, private equity, and holding companies will do this. One that's of note to the UK that recently was announced but not yet completed or approved was Eaton's proposed purchase of Cobham's fuel and air division, which does most of the air-to-air refueling systems, you know, in the world's military fleets. One thing is for certain is that the blind pursuit of scale without synergies is going to ebb. Before this crisis came about, one of the big mergers that have been announced was Woodward and Hexcel, an actuation and fuel systems company getting together with a carbon fiber prepreg company. Made absolutely no sense other than just getting big. And one of the first things they wisely did is they unwound it. And again, you know, I think one of the questions that this raises in my mind is if Boeing right now is kind of capital constrained, they've got over $40 billion of net debt, and yet they need to launch a new aircraft. Does this mean that Boeing is going to have a rapprochement with its big tier ones that it's been at war with? You know, the Collinses and Honeywells and Safrans and others that Boeing has been battling with partnering for success. Well, if you're going to launch a new aircraft, you're going to need risk-sharing partners. Who has the best balance sheets? Who has the capital to share at some of these really big companies? Next page, please. And again, apologies for the diagram not coming through, but I'm sure we'll get that fixed, and the speech will be distributed later on with the proper graphics. But what happens in the sub-tiers, you know, I think in the tier twos, some attrition will take place there, targeted acquisitions by tier ones, and I think we'll see some unwinding of poorly constructed tier ones, which will add to the ranks of tier twos. In other words, a great example of this is TransDigm bought Esterline, which was a company put together through acquisition who was trying to behave as a tier one. It wasn't a tier one, and TransDigm has pretty much abolished the corporate structure and has created over 15 tier two component companies as a result, including names like Barco and Canadian Marconi that have gone back to their old brand names. In the tier three level, make to print shops, that's where we're going to see a lot of attrition. Diversified suppliers serving defense, BGA, and aerospace customers are best positioned, and government aid programs can have a big influence, you know, on what happens here. It's interesting, in the Midlands and in the UK in general, there aren't a lot of examples that we can point to of failures. And when I've asked executives, British executives and industry association executives as to why this is the case, I think they feel that in the UK, there, you know, a lot of the smaller suppliers have more defense and military exposure, and that does help cushion the blow. But at the same time, the federal support of the supply chain has not been very well constructed. It's been a little bit more of a hands-off approach in the UK. And I think that's certainly something to watch. At the tier 4 level, where we get into raw materials, forging, casting, we'll see the whipsaw effect where we're getting reduced volumes plus destocking going on. But most of the consolidation has already taken place in the tier 4. So the companies here have pretty strong balance sheets. And I'm talking about, you know, companies like, you know, Arconic and Kaiser and Alaris and Precision Cast Parts that have pretty strong balance sheets. So I don't think we're going to see as much attrition here. Next slide, please. So those are my comments for today. So I've kind of hit two key subjects, but clearly, you know, a lot of heritage and the mark that that Rolls-Royce and the Midlands has made on the industry, you know, going back to the advent of the jet engine for that matter, is unparalleled. And we've got some tricky times ahead. The Midlands has come through these crises before. You know, we had really nasty crisis in the early 70s where Rolls-Royce was very, very near within weeks of going under, and it pulled through and it went to greater days, and I'm sure Rolls-Royce will do the same again. So with that, then I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. I really enjoyed your lecture, especially after the COVID announcement on the UK on Monday. And again, apologies for some of the lecture slides. Just make people don't have to look at me.
Oh, by the way, if any of you are curious, why, this is Hawaii behind me. I am in Hawaii right now, so I'm 10 time zones away, and the sun is just coming up, during this lecture. So I put the background slide on here. This is not the view out of my window, but I just didn't want you to get blasted with the sunrise here.
Just waiting for some of the comments to come through.
I see the question here from Anonymous.
Yes.
I can read that as well as you can. It's sad that the only woman's success was talked about only being due to being caught a break in circumstances, allowing her to do when the men weren't talked about in this way. Hopefully next time. Yeah, Carolyn Corvi's story, I feel it's super important, and it's in some ways it's sad that to the questioner's point that what she faced at the time, and yet she broke through, and her legacy is incredibly solid. And here we are now, all these years later, and the demographics have changed somewhat, but there's still an enormous challenge. I mean, diversity still remains an enormous challenge, and this industry is still too far male dominated right now, and I know it's a major objective, not only on boards, but within the leadership teams. And as I look across, at some of the big aerospace primes, where you look at, Northrop here in the States, Northrop Grumman, until recently Lockheed Martin, Boeing's defense division, all led by female executives, showing what they can do. But yet there's just a lot more, much more to be done. But Carolyn Corvi today, she retired out of Boeing, I think about a decade ago or more, but she's on the boards of United Airlines, of Allegheny Technologies, one of the big tier fours. So she's still very active and engaged, but yet it's a story that we can't forget, because I think it's inspiring.
There's another one come through saying, interesting historic look. Any thoughts on the qualities or areas of expertise required of future leaders in aerospace?
Can you repeat that, please?
Sorry, it says, interesting historic look. Any thoughts on the qualities or areas of expertise required of future leaders in aerospace?
Oh, what are the attributes of future leaders, and what will be required? I find it interesting that, to go back to Carolyn for a second, liberal arts major going into a, male-dominated engineering company, and I think I didn't talk today about Industry 4.0 and what's happening there, and clearly, it's a major push in British aerospace, and if anything, I mean, this crisis and some of the emerging tools come along, with Industry 4.0, like model-based systems engineering, to name one. It means that the way we do our work is going to be dramatically different, and it means that the team skills, the ability to think horizontally, the ability to work in teams and get things done through teams, I think across cultures, across gender barriers, all of that is going to be far more critical. And so whilst we will always need our hardcore technical and engineering specialists, we definitely need those, and we need more of those, not fewer. But when you're asking me the question about leaders, I think it's going to be those people that can combine the hard skills and soft skills, and to have a big picture view. And we're entering an era now that is becoming more political. We came through this golden era the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, where we had one ecosystem and we could really just focus on making the best product, at least in the commercial world. And supporting it the best and, rolling up concepts like total care. And now we're in an era where we may be headed to two ecosystems where the Russians and Chinese are maybe, doing their thing on aircraft like the C929, and where it's just going to be a lot more tricky in terms of how we navigate things, going forward. And so I think having that big picture view of what's going on in the international system to complement what's going on in technology and economics and these new tools, I think that's going to be much more important. And if you take a company like Boeing right now, and I think a lot of us look at Boeing and they say, where are the leaders? Where is the Sir Ralph Robbins? Where's the Brian Rowe? Where's the Alan Mulally that can look at this situation now and do what is so patently obvious, that Boeing needs to launch a new aircraft, and it needs to do it as soon as possible? Where are the leaders? We're going to need people like that going forward.
Thank you. And then we've had another one, which is an interesting question from an anonymous person saying, looking forward with the requirements of net zero, who do you think are the bold leaders?
Oh, and net zero. Oh, so this is a tricky one, because I must first tell you what my thoughts are in net zero, and then I'll answer the question of what it means. I mean, I think, so we have this goal of 2035. European governments pushing us this way. I mean, globally, European governments are pushing us. Airbus, of course, has come out with these three concepts. They're talking 2035, and I'll be honest with you, I just don't think that's feasible. I think it's a stretch goal. I think, given the fact that you're going to need completely new infrastructure, completely new designs, hydrogen takes up 4 or 5 times the volume of conventional fuel, et cetera. I think take 2035 and add 10 to 15 years. I think it is a bit of a bubble. And it's not to say that we do not go for it as an industry and invest in it and go where we can go, but we just have the laws of physics and energy density working against us. So in net zero, will investment in that go on? Yes. Will we have hydrogen jetliners by 2035? Hell no. What does that mean? It means that sustainable aviation fuels are going to be more critical, carbon offsets, new technologies that remove carbon from the atmosphere, air traffic control, air traffic management, single skies, all of that stuff is going to be absolutely critical. Hybrid electric can play a role at the margins in regional jets and smaller aircraft, but hydrogen by 2035, isn't going to happen, in my view. But if we talk 2045 to 2050, it might. Now, I think it goes back to my point earlier, is I think we're entering this period after a period of stasis where it was relatively calm and the environment was easy to understand. You not only have these geopolitical constraints, but you have an onrushing train coming in aviation, which is the global, it's climate change. And for too long, we've been in denial as an industry. And I will say, especially on this side of the pond in America, absolutely. So many people in denial. I can't tell you today, I still hear people saying, well, we're only 2.5% of carbon emissions. What's the big deal? I hear that all the time, but obviously we will be the fastest growing amongst transportation. And there's a risk that we could become the new tobacco industry of the global economy if we don't get our act together. Unfortunately, I don't see hydrogen. I don't see, given the technology readiness levels, I don't see that happening by 2035, but I applaud Airbus for its investment and setting out some broad, ambitious targets and aircraft concepts that have a lot of promise.
Thank you. So we've got another one from Richard Goodhead saying, hi, Kevin. What impact do you think fly scum might have on air travel?
Can you repeat that, please?
It says, what impact do you think fly scum might have on air travel? Fly and then GSKAM. Am I saying that right?
Can you spell that again, please?
FLYGSKAM.
Oh, got it. Yes, okay. Yeah, this is the shaming movement by, oh, got it. Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is really a cultural movement, against viewing air travel as being, ultimately really, it's not only bad for the environment, but selfish and shaming people. It's the shame movement. It's interesting. I think thus far, it's really been confined to a handful of Northern European countries, and where you've seen some tangible evidence of it impacting air travel. For the rest of Europe, very limited impact. Does that mean it will not grow in the future, especially if aviation is not seen as doing its part? Absolutely, it could. I think it's a headwind that could spread to continental Europe, and in this crisis now, the French government pushing for using trains for flights below a certain, distance. And here in the Americas, I think it is a fringe movement that is not widespread, and it's not having a tangible impact yet. And I don't see it doing so for the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, here in the States right now, we're fortunate. It's the population. If you look at the survey results, what percent of Americans don't believe in climate change as a serious threat? It's pretty much the highest of any major economy. And then in Asia, I don't even think this is on the radar. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I think it's a modest headwind, primarily confined in Northern Europe right now, with the potential to spread to a bit more of Europe and to parts of America in the next 10 to 15 years. And if we're not viewed as being progressive and coming out with new designs and, sustainable aviation fuels and hybrid and offsets and all the rest, it's only going to grow.
Great, thank you. And then we've got another question from Devon saying, has COVID created any new opportunities that companies can take advantage of right now?
Has COVID created any new opportunities for achieving competitive advantage?
Yes, yeah.
That's an interesting question. We've done a number of surveys recently, supply chain surveys, to get a sense of how some of the big customers are looking at COVID and what it means for what they're going to do. And right now, COVID in some cases could accelerate investment into Industry 4.0 technologies used for design development, production, and supply chain. Just the fact that we're having this conference this way, is case in point. So I think there are a lot of fascinating tools in Industry 4.0 that haven't really been unleashed on the commercial aerospace ecosystem because we haven't had a new white sheet. And this is why we need a steady diet of new programs, whether it's the UltraFan or Boeing's next new aircraft or what have you, because until we get new programs, we can't really develop these tools. What's happening right now is where these tools are being used more than anywhere else is in the military world. And it's in smaller programs that we are not reading about too much in industry press. Let me give you an example on this side of the pond. The Pentagon is now putting out RFPs for competitions where the OEMs have 2 or 3 years to put prototypes, flying prototypes in the air instead of the usual 5 or 6. And they're telling them to use model-based systems engineering to do it. And you're seeing small teams do heroic things in very, very short periods of time. And but it's in the military, and it's small projects, and the customer is willing to pay for that, and they're willing to pay for the investment, subsidize some of the investments in those tools. So I actually think what we're going to see is, I think in some cases, we're going to see the military lead commercial in deployment of Industry 4.0 tools, and that And I say that creates a new set of winners and losers potentially, in this industry going forward. Do I think that, low cost sourcing, dual sourcing, all that stuff? I actually think we're moving to more regional supply chains and less global supply chains. I think you're going to see a stronger emphasis in Europe, for example, the train being pulled by Airbus, even though Airbus has been trying to diversify and get more US dollar denominated content. But if you look at things like aerostructures, I think we're moving away from far-flung global supply chains to more regionally concentrated supply chains. And I think there will be a much greater emphasis placed on the carbon footprint of the supply chain itself. And this is being led by Europe. So it's not just having fuel-efficient aircraft and alternative fuels, but it's actually, what is the carbon footprint of our supply chain? And if we're chasing parts all over the world, where you're shipping raw material from Europe to Asia for machining, to the US for processing, back to Asia, back to Europe, what's the carbon footprint of making that part? And that is now, I think, on the agenda, being led by Europe, and that'll create a new set of winners and losers as well.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Dan saying, with increasing environmental pressures, do you foresee an increase on production of regional jets and turboprop regarding the forecast production?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at, there are some paradoxical things going on, some cross currents, because on one hand, airlines have been down gauging, and we all know about that. And I think we know the statistics. And it turns out that the E-jets and the larger CRJs are pretty popular, right now in this down gauge environment, because airlines are keeping frequencies where they can with the smallest aircraft and the smallest trip costs. So we all understand that. But yet, the production rates haven't increased. And, we're really essentially down to one business jet producer, Embraer. And we're down in essence to really one turboprop producer, which is ATR. And I think, so will there be continued ongoing demand for those aircraft? Absolutely. And I think if you look at the demographics of the fleet today, there are a lot of, regional jets are pretty much, they need to retire by the time they're 20 or 22. It's physical. It's not even economic. So the CRJs aren't going to be 25-year aircraft. So if you look at the demographics, there's going to be a big wave of retirements coming, and we've seen some of that already. And if you couple that with the fact that there will be ongoing demand for these shorter routes with more efficient aircraft, I think the door is wide open for what Embraer has contemplated, which is a new turboprop, what they call the E3. So I think the door is certainly open there. It looks like Mitsubishi has stepped back and has pretty much put their program on pause. It reminds us of how difficult it is. But there's clearly an opportunity, in my view, for an Embraer to come forward with a new aircraft aimed at that space, whether it's a turboprop or jet.
Thank you. And one from Charles Cuddington, and he says, thank you for my honourable mention. And then he goes on to say, you didn't mention climate change as an issue that will influence the industry, both its recovery and restructuring. What are your thoughts?
Is that pilot training, you said? What is the pilot?
So you didn't mention climate change as an issue that will influence the industry
pilot
in both
training,
its recovery and restructuring.
You know what? I mean, there were shortages of pilots before the crisis. Guess what? There isn't a shortage anymore. I mean, if there is any silver lining out of this whole terrible crisis we're in right now, it's that we don't have a pilot crisis anymore. We've got an excess of pilots. Now, the demographics are still there. The same issues are still there that we were facing before. But look, we're not going to get back to the pre-COVID installed base, for probably another 3 years. And so I think that crisis has been averted for the moment. And it's not to say that when the industry comes roaring back at some point that we won't start confronting those realities again, but I don't see that as being an issue right now.
Then we have an anonymous one saying, thank you, Kevin, a great talk. Any thought on the power by hour concept in the time of a downturn?
Yeah, yeah, the power by the hour concept, and of course, you know, the Rolls-Royce business is built on the power by the hour in total care, and in a sense, Rolls-Royce really taught the world how to do it right, and it was a business model that worked exquisitely well for decades. Total care and high sign-up rates, and I think you're all familiar with those numbers. But now the dilemma is that not only is the Trent fleet aging, where you're getting a large portion of the fleet up in the 15 plus year category, but we're in this period now where we're going to see a big wave of aircraft part and engine part outs and green time management. And so that means that Rolls-Royce has to adapt its business model. Airlines want more flexible work scopes. They want to take advantage of engine part outs and incorporate what we call used and serviceable material in the overhauls. And before the crisis began, Rolls-Royce did a lot of innovation. And, Richard Goodhead asked the question earlier, but Rolls-Royce did a lot of really good innovation on its value propositions in services, where you could give customers and lessors a offering that was more tailored to what they want in flexible work scopes, or tailoring it. If, for example, I'm going to only hold my Trents for another 5 years and it's due for an overhaul, do I really want to replace the life limited parts that will have 10 years of life on them when I only really need 5? And Rolls-Royce really began to address those issues, right before the crisis began. And I think it's a good thing they did, because in the post-COVID world, I think there's going to be a much greater focus on flexible work scopes. It's going to challenge OEMs like Rolls. That means independents are going to be in a position to incorporate used and serviceable material and to be greater competition. And Rolls is really going to have to lean hard on those value propositions, because I didn't talk about it today, but a wave of part outs unparalleled in our history is on the way. It hasn't started yet. It won't start probably until later this year or next year, but we will see an unprecedented number of aircraft and engine part outs with used and serviceable material that will eventually flood the market. It's not happening now because MRO demand is so low and the economic case is not there to part out aircraft, but that will change, and there is enormous dry powder and there's enormous amounts of capital that are ready and willing to part out aircraft and engines. The demand isn't there yet, and the pricing isn't there yet for this to happen, but it will happen.
And then we've got time for one final one from Phil, saying, how do you see role of the aircraft leaser, specifically post-COVID, and then going forward for the next 10 years?
Yeah, so what's the outlook for lessors? And, before this crisis, I think it was pretty well documented. There was there were not only a lot of new lessors entering the market, but there was a lot of what I'm going to call less educated capital coming in the market. And why? Because the industry had been in a 20-year winning streak where it kept growing and growing and growing year after year. It powered through the Great Recession in 2009, 2010. So if you're someone out there with capital looking for returns, and you're not getting good returns on government bonds and that sort of stuff anymore, capital inevitably found its way to this class of assets that are mobile and relatively safe. That class of assets is A320s and 737s and A330s and 777s, and so capital flooded in. And so here we are now post-COVID. And so you're going to see a weeding out of some of the players that got in and really were not committed to the market, really did not understand the risks or the nature of these downside scenarios. I don't know that we've seen a widespread failure of lessors yet, but I would certainly look for consolidation. Number two is this crisis, if anything, will probably underscore the point, 40% of the world's fleet is owned by lessors, and we were running at about 50% of the orders before the crisis. And I think, if anything, this crisis is going to remind airlines that stuff happens, that we can have really nasty downturns, and that you're probably better off being more flexible with your fleet, which means that maybe you have a higher percentage of the fleet leased than before. So I think it will. We'll see consolidation. I think it will be. We'll see some carnage in certain balance sheets, and I also think at the same time that we'll see a higher percentage of the fleet leased on the other side of the crisis than before the crisis?
Thank you. Some really interesting questions there, and thank you to everyone on the call for asking some fantastic questions. I'm just going to hand over to Chris now for the vote of thanks.
Really, on behalf of the Derby Royal Aeronautical Society branch and the Rolls-Royce Heritage Society, I'd like to thank you very much, Kevin, for a fascinating lecture. I think you've given us some examples of sort of key leaders who've hugely influenced the shape of civil aerospace as it is today, and it's really shown and highlighted the importance of innovation and vision and that push to make bold, courageous decisions to push new technology forward. I really appreciate you doing that. It's some fantastic examples there, and you're taking us through the unprecedented COVID challenge and your insights in how the industry could develop and those potential outcomes. Where I must admit personally, I can think of no example from history where for aviation where this type of thing has happened in this way. So
Yes.
Thank you for it's difficult to know what the future will hold, so thank you for sharing that. But I think the latter part of your talk and with the questions, I think sharing your view on the future of where aviation could go and where new innovation could develop, I think gives us all a big uplift to say that that challenge is still out there and we've got something good to look forward to. So really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Paulus, if I could, I wanted, I didn't say this very well or as forcefully as I need to, but, for the Midlands and, and for Rolls-Royce, and I know there were questions about hydrogen and electric. Rolls-Royce absolutely needs to push ahead. I mean, you're facing these two much bigger competitors or three, and I think, Rolls-Royce has to differentiate itself with its product because it's not going to differentiate itself with its scale. So I was trying to be real on when I think hydrogen was coming, but I wasn't trying to say it doesn't matter. And I really, Rolls-Royce has to differentiate itself, and the British government really needs to get behind, do more, help more. This is an icon. And we, everything you've all done to create this incredible, one of the best clusters in the world, most capable clusters in the world, we've got to keep this. It's essential to our industry's innovation that the Midlands cluster gets to the other side of this intact and better. So I'm really looking forward to seeing, how Rolls-Royce navigates this and how all of you do as well. So I do appreciate it, and it's an honor to speak to the Royal Aeronautical Society. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.